The alarm on my wrist device screamed before I even understood why. I was standing on the observation deck of a trading station above a quiet blue world, and every screen around me had turned red at the same moment. My name is Kalis Orvin, and I have lived among the stars for over 200 cycles, but nothing prepared me for what I was about to witness. A human trade envoy named Laura Bennett stood beside me, her cup of tea frozen halfway to her lips, her eyes locked on the same screen as mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I had known humans for many years by then. I had eaten at their tables, laughed at their strange jokes, and once even cried at one of their funerals, though I did not fully understand the ritual. Humans were the gentlest species I had ever met, in a galaxy full of sharp edges and colder hearts. They smiled at strangers. They shared food with species who had nothing to offer in return. They forgave insults that would have started wars among my people. I had grown so used to their patience that I had almost forgotten they were capable of anything else. That morning, the peace ended. A distress signal had come from a small human settlement on the edge of contested space, a modest colony called Fairhaven, home to perhaps 12,000 people who farmed golden grain under an artificial sky. I had visited Fairhaven once, invited by a farmer named Peter Grant, who had shown me how his children played a game called cricket in a field behind his home. He had given me a slice of pie and told me that one day, when the galaxy grew tired of fighting, everyone would sit at tables like his. The signal from Fairhaven was not a call for help. It was silence, cut off mid-transmission, followed by an image no one wanted to see twice. Laura set down her cup so gently that it made no sound, which somehow frightened me more than if she had thrown it across the room. She turned to me, her face pale, and said only 3 words. They hit Fairhaven. I did not understand yet what those words truly meant. I thought of Fairhaven as a peaceful place, undefended, unimportant to anyone with ambitions of power. I asked her who would do such a thing, and why. She did not answer. She simply turned and walked toward the communication hub, her steps quick and steady, and I followed, because some instinct told me that whatever happened next would matter more than anything I had witnessed in 2 centuries of life. The station around us had gone quiet in a way I had never experienced. Traders from a dozen species stopped their haggling. Diplomats stopped their endless meetings. Even the station's automated announcements seemed to hesitate before speaking. Everyone had felt it, that shift in the air, the way animals sense a coming storm long before the clouds appear. I had read historical records of humanity's early wars, among themselves, back when they were still confined to their home planet. I had studied their conflicts the way a scholar studies ancient ruins, curious but detached, certain that the humans I now knew, gentle and warm and endlessly forgiving, were nothing like their ancestors. I believed civilization had softened them. I believed peace had become part of who they were. I did not yet understand that peace, for humans, was a choice they made every single day, and a choice can be unmade. In the communication hub, dozens of screens displayed reports flooding in from human networks. I could not read the language quickly enough, but Laura translated pieces for me as she worked, her voice flat and controlled in a way that did not match the trembling of her hands. Fairhaven's shield generator had failed under an attack that came without warning, without demand, without any of the usual rituals of war that other species followed. There had been no ultimatum, no declaration, just an attack from an armed fleet belonging to a rival power known as the Dreven Compact, a coalition of species who had long viewed humanity's peaceful reputation as a weakness to be exploited. I remembered hearing whispers about the Dreven Compact in trade circles, always spoken with a kind of nervous respect. They were not the strongest military power in known space, but they were among the cruelest, and they had grown bold in recent years, testing weaker worlds, absorbing smaller colonies into their expanding borders. I had assumed humanity was too valuable a trading partner, too well connected across the galaxy, to ever become a target. I was wrong. Laura's fingers moved across her console, pulling up casualty estimates that made my stomach turn. though I said nothing, because I did not know what words would help. She was not crying, she was not shouting. She simply worked, her jaw tight, her eyes scanning data, with a focus I had never seen in her before. I had always known Laura as someone who laughed easily, who once spent an entire evening teaching me how to play a card game just so I would not feel left out of a party. The woman beside me now felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. I asked her if there was anything I could do. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression made me feel small, though she had never once made me feel that way before. "Not yet," she said, "but there will be." Around the station, other species began to react in their own ways. Some expressed sympathy, offering the usual formal condolences that meant little and cost nothing. Others speculated quietly about what humanity's response would be, placing bets in hushed voices as though this were a game rather than a tragedy. I overheard a merchant from a reptilian trading house remark that humans would likely file a complaint with the regional council, demand sanctions, perhaps organize a peaceful protest fleet. He said this with a small laugh, as though the idea of humans doing anything more forceful was absurd. I did not laugh. Something about Laura's silence told me that the merchant's confidence was misplaced. Hours passed. The station's public channels filled with statements from various governments, most of them cautious, diplomatic, careful not to provoke further conflict. But the human channels remained almost entirely quiet. No press conferences, no angry speeches, no declarations of retaliation. It was as if humanity's leaders had simply stopped speaking to the rest of the galaxy altogether. I found this silence unsettling in a way I could not explain at the time. I had grown used to humans being loud, in the best possible way, always ready with an opinion, a joke, a story, a warm word for anyone who needed one. Their sudden quiet felt like walking into a familiar room and finding all the furniture gone. Laura finally stepped away from her console late into the station's artificial night cycle. She looked exhausted, though not in the way species usually looked exhausted from lack of rest. It was a deeper kind of tiredness, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy without being able to put it down. I asked her, gently, what she thought would happen next. She was quiet for a long time before she answered. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made the words more frightening than if she had shouted them. "You have known us for a long time, Kalis," she said. "You have seen how we love. You have seen how we forgive. You have seen how far we bend before we break." She paused, looking out the viewport at the stars beyond, her reflection ghost-like against the glass. "You have never seen what happens after we break." I did not know how to respond to that. I had spent 2 centuries believing I understood humanity, believing their patience was infinite, their gentleness a permanent feature of who they were, rather than a controlled and deliberate restraint. In that moment, standing beside a woman I considered a friend, I realized how little I truly understood about the species everyone assumed they had already figured out. Word spread quickly across the station and beyond it, rippling outward through trade networks and diplomatic channels alike. Fairhaven was gone. Not conquered, not occupied, simply gone, its people scattered between those who had escaped in evacuation pods and those who had not been fortunate enough to reach them in time. I thought of Peter Grant and his cricket field, his children running across golden grass, his warm invitation to a future where everyone might finally sit together at the same table. I did not know if he had survived. The Dragoon Compact issued a brief statement calling the attack a necessary demonstration of strength, a warning to any who doubted their growing power in the region. They made no mention of surrender terms or demands, because they did not believe they needed to negotiate with a species they considered soft, sentimental, and fundamentally unwilling to fight back with anything more than words. I remember thinking, in that quiet moment before everything changed, that the Dragoon Compact had made a terrible mistake, though I could not yet articulate why I believed it. Perhaps it was Laura's silence. Perhaps it was the strange stillness that had settled over every human I saw in the following hours. a stillness that felt less like grief and more like the moment before a held breath is finally released. I did not know yet that I was witnessing the last calm morning before the galaxy learned something it would never forget. I did not know that the species everyone had underestimated for its kindness was about to teach the stars an entirely different lesson, one written not in diplomacy, but in the terrible clarity of a people who had finally run out of patience. All I knew, standing there beside Laura Bennett as the station's lights dimmed for the artificial night, was that something ancient and quiet had woken up inside a species I thought I understood completely. And for the first time since I had met humanity, I felt something I had never expected to feel around them. I felt afraid. Not of Laura, not of the humans I had called friends for so many years. I felt afraid for the Dreven Compact, and for anyone else in the galaxy who still believed that humanity's gentleness meant they had nothing else to give. I would soon learn just how wrong that belief truly was. The silence lasted 3 days, and those 3 days changed how I understood time itself. I had expected grief to look loud. I had expected human networks to fill with anger, with calls for justice, with the kind of emotional outpouring I had witnessed during smaller tragedies in the past. Instead, something far stranger happened. The human channels across the station, across every trade route I could monitor, simply went quiet. Not empty, not shut down, but quiet, in a deliberate way, like a room where everyone has stopped talking because something important is about to happen. Laura barely slept during those 3 days. I watched her move between meetings I was not permitted to attend, her expression unreadable, her voice calm whenever she spoke to me, though I could see something behind her eyes that had not been there before. She still brought me tea in the mornings. She still asked about my family back on my homeworld. But there was a distance in her now, as though part of her had already left to stand somewhere I could not follow. On the second day, I met a young man named Nathan Cole, an engineer who worked on the station's docking bay, and who had always been talkative, always ready with a story about his childhood or a joke about station food. When I greeted him that morning, he barely looked up from the ship he was repairing. I asked him if he was well. He told me he was fine, though his hands moved with a precision I had never seen from him before, tightening bolts with a focus that seemed almost mechanical. I asked him what he was working on. He told me he was making sure every ship in the bay could reach maximum speed within minutes of being called. I asked him why that mattered now. He looked at me then, and his eyes carried a weight I did not recognize from the easygoing man I had known for over a year. "Because we're going to need them," he said, and returned to his work without another word. I began to notice similar behavior throughout the station, and beyond it, reported through trade contacts across dozens of systems. Human shipping companies quietly rerouted cargo. Human banks froze certain transactions. Human communication networks that normally buzzed with casual conversation between species had gone almost entirely dark, replaced by tightly controlled official statements that gave away nothing. It was not panic. That was what confused me most. If this had been fear, I would have expected chaos, evacuation, desperate pleas for protection from allied species. Instead, what I witnessed was organization. Careful, deliberate, unified organization, spreading across a species I had always known to argue among themselves about nearly everything. I had studied human history enough to know that their homeworld had once been divided into hundreds of nations, each with different languages, different beliefs, different quarrels that had lasted for generations. Even after they left their solar system, those old divisions had never fully disappeared. Human politics remained famously complicated, filled with disagreements that seemed, to outside observers like myself, endless and occasionally absurd. And yet, in the days following the attack on Fairhaven, something happened that should have been impossible. Every human faction, every corporation, every colony government, every rival political party that had spent decades arguing over budgets and borders and old grievances fell into perfect alignment. There were no public debates, no dissenting statements, No factions breaking away to pursue their own interests, as I might have expected from any other species facing a crisis of this scale. I asked Laura about this once, during a rare, quiet moment when she allowed herself a few minutes to sit and breathe. I asked her how it was possible that humans, who argued about everything, had become so completely united in a matter of days. She considered the question carefully before answering, the way she always did when she wanted to give me an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. "We argue about everything that doesn't matter," she said. "Politics, money, whose turn it is to do the dishes. But every single one of us grew up hearing the same stories about what happens when someone tries to hurt a child, or a family, or a home. Those stories cross every border we ever built for ourselves." She paused, looking down at her hands. Fairhaven wasn't a military target. It was families, children, people who planted crops and raised animals and taught their kids how to read. That kind of attack doesn't divide us. It reminds us what we actually agree on. I thought about this for a long time afterward. I had always believed unity required agreement on everything, the way it did among some of my own people, where entire councils could collapse over disputes about trade tariffs or border disputes. Humanity's unity, I realized, worked differently. It came not from agreement, but from something deeper, a shared sense of what mattered most, buried beneath all their surface disagreements, waiting for the right moment to surface. By the third day, reports began reaching the station of unprecedented activity across human shipyards. I had access to certain trade logs through my position as a cultural liaison, and what I saw there defied everything I understood about industrial capability. Shipyards that normally produced cargo vessels and passenger transports had converted almost overnight to produce something else entirely. Factories that manufactured farming equipment now produced components I did not recognize. Entire supply chains that had operated for peaceful commerce for decades reorganized themselves within 72 hours into something clearly built for a different purpose. I asked a contact of mine, a logistics coordinator named Sophie Marsh, what exactly was being produced in such quantities. She gave me a long look before answering, the kind of look that told me she was deciding how much truth I could handle. "Everything," she finally said. "Ships, supplies, medical equipment, defense systems, whatever it takes." I asked her how humanity had managed to organize such a massive shift in production so quickly, without months of planning, without the kind of bureaucratic delay I had always associated with large-scale human projects. She smiled then, though there was no humor in it. "We've been planning for centuries," she said, "not for this exact moment, but for the possibility of it. Every human colony has contingency systems built into its infrastructure, systems most people never think about because we never expected to need them. We built for peace, Kalis, but we never stopped preparing in case peace failed." I found this revelation deeply unsettling, though I could not fully explain why. Perhaps because it suggested a version of humanity I had never considered, one that existed alongside the friendly, forgiving people I had known, hidden beneath the surface, like a foundation supporting a house I had only ever admired from the outside. On the fourth day, I encountered Peter Grant again, though not in the way I expected. I had assumed, given the destruction of Fairhaven, that I might never see him again. Instead, I found him on a communication screen in the station's public terminal, being interviewed by a human news network. He looked exhausted, his face marked by a grief that made my chest ache to witness, but he was alive, having escaped Fairhaven in one of the last evacuation pods before the shield generator failed completely. The interviewer asked him what he wanted to say to the people responsible for the attack. I expected him to express anger, perhaps a desire for justice through legal or diplomatic channels, the kind of response I had always associated with humanity's usual approach to conflict. Instead, Peter looked directly into the camera, his eyes steady despite everything he had endured, and said something that I have never forgotten. "I planted those fields myself," he said. "My children played in that grass. We never hurt anyone. We never asked for anything except to be left alone, to live our lives." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a quiet resolve replacing the exhaustion. "I used to believe forgiveness was always the answer. I still believe that, most of the time. But there's a difference between forgiveness and doing nothing. We are not doing nothing." The interview ended shortly after that, but the words stayed with me for the rest of that day and long into the next. I began to understand something about humanity that I had never fully grasped before, despite my centuries of study and friendship with their species. Their gentleness was not weakness. It was not naivety. It was a choice, deliberate and constant, maintained through effort and restraint that most other species never even attempted. And choices, once broken, do not simply disappear. They transform into something else entirely. By the end of the 4th day, I received word through official channels that a formal address would be given by representatives of the United Human Colonies, broadcast across every network in known space. I gathered with Laura, Nathan, and Sophie in the station's main viewing hall, along with representatives from dozens of other species, all of us waiting to hear what humanity would say after days of unsettling silence. The address, when it finally came, was brief. A woman named Claire Wood, speaking on behalf of the United Human Colonial Council, stood before the cameras with a calm that felt heavier than any shouted declaration could have been. She spoke of Fairhaven, of the families lost, of the choice her people now faced. "For generations," she said, "we have chosen patience, we have chosen diplomacy, we have chosen to accept insult after insult in the name of peace, because we believed peace was worth protecting, even at great personal cost." She paused, and the silence that followed felt like it stretched across every system listening. That peace was never weakness, it was restraint, and restraint, once removed, does not return easily. She did not make threats. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated, with the same calm certainty Laura had shown me days earlier, that humanity's response would come, and that it would match what had been taken from them, though what that meant exactly, she did not specify. The broadcast ended, and the room fell into an uneasy quiet. Representatives from other species exchanged glances, some doubtful, others visibly nervous. I remained silent throughout, thinking of Peter Grant's steady eyes, of Nathan Cole's precise hands working on ships built for speed, of Sophie Marsh's admission that humanity had prepared for this possibility for centuries without ever wanting it to arrive. I looked at Laura, who stood beside me with her arms crossed, watching the now blank screen with an expression I had never seen on her face before. I asked her, quietly, if she believed her people's response would be measured, careful, controlled in the way their leader had suggested. She turned to me, and for the first time since Fairhaven fell, I saw something in her eyes that reminded me of the woman I had known for years, warm and familiar, though shadowed now by something new. "It will be controlled," she said. "That's what makes it serious, Kalis. We're not upset in a way that makes us reckless. We're upset in a way that makes us precise." I did not fully understand what she meant until the following days, when the true scale of humanity's response began to unfold across the stars, revealing a side of this gentle, patient species that the rest of the galaxy had never imagined they possessed, and would never be able to forget once they witnessed it. 5 days after the fall of Fairhaven, I received an invitation I did not expect, and one I would remember for the rest of my long life. Laura found me in the station's garden dome, a quiet place filled with plants from a dozen different worlds, where I often went to think when the noise of trade and diplomacy grew too heavy. She sat beside me without a word for several minutes, watching the artificial light shift slowly across the leaves above us. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been in days. "There's a fleet gathering near the outer relay station," she said. "Command has cleared a small group of civilian observers to witness the assembly. I put your name on the list, if you want to go." I asked her why she would offer me such access, given everything happening. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because you've known us a long time, Kalis. Longer than most. I think you deserve to understand what's coming, rather than hearing about it secondhand. She paused. And maybe I need someone there who still remembers who we were before this started. I agreed without hesitation, though I did not fully understand what I was agreeing to until we arrived at the relay station 2 days later, aboard a transport ship called the Meridian's Hope, crewed by young engineers and pilots who spoke little during the journey, their focus entirely on preparation checklists and equipment inspections. The outer relay station sat at the edge of human-controlled space, a massive structure normally used for routing civilian and commercial traffic between systems. When our transport approached, I understood immediately why Laura had wanted me to see this with my own eyes rather than through a screen. Ships filled the space around the station in numbers I had never seen gathered in one place, not even during the largest trade conventions I had attended over my long life. Vessels of every size moved with careful coordination, forming patterns that seemed almost choreographed, guided by a communication network so precise that not a single ship drifted out of position. I had grown used to human engineering being impressive in its creativity, but this was something different entirely. This was engineering built for a single, terrible purpose, and executed with a discipline that contradicted everything I thought I understood about a species famous for its emotional warmth. Nathan Cole met us at the docking bay, wearing a uniform I had not seen him in before, his expression calm but focused in a way that reminded me of a different person than the easygoing engineer I had known on the trade station. He guided us through the relay station's central corridor, explaining briefly what we were seeing, though I sensed he was choosing his words carefully, revealing only what he believed I needed to know. "Every colony sent something," he said, gesturing toward the viewport as we passed, where I could see ships bearing markings from dozens of different human settlements, some from wealthy core worlds, others from small frontier colonies I had never even heard mentioned in trade discussions. Doesn't matter how big or small a colony is, everyone sent what they could. I asked him how such coordination was possible without months of negotiation between colonial governments that, as far as I knew, often disagreed on matters far less serious than this. He stopped walking for a moment, looking at me directly, and something in his eyes carried a weight I had never associated with him before. "You don't understand yet," he said. "This isn't about agreement. It's about family. Doesn't matter if we argue about taxes or trade routes back home. When someone hurts one of ours, that argument stops mattering." We continued through the station until we reached a large observation deck overlooking the central docking arrays, where Laura introduced me to several officials I did not recognize, each of them polite but clearly preoccupied, their attention constantly drawn toward status reports flickering across handheld devices. I noticed something interesting in their behavior, a quality I had not expected to find among people preparing for what I now understood to be a significant military response. They were not agitated, they were not driven by the kind of visible anger I might have expected from a species pushed past its limits. Instead, they moved with a calm, methodical focus, as though every action had already been planned and rehearsed long before this moment arrived. I mentioned this observation to Laura, and she nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the fleet assembling beyond the viewport. "Anger that shows on the outside burns fast and fades," she said. "The kind that matters doesn't show at all. It just gets quiet and focused and patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment." I thought of the merchant I had overheard back on the trade station, the one who had laughed at the idea of humans responding with anything more than a diplomatic complaint. I wondered if he could see what I was seeing now, whether his laughter would have died in his throat, the way mine surely would have, had I possessed the same physical response. Later that day, I was introduced to a woman named Grace Miller, a fleet coordinator who had spent the better part of 2 decades working in human colonial defense before the majority of her career had focused entirely on civilian logistics, back when peace seemed a permanent condition rather than a fragile agreement. She spoke to me candidly, perhaps because she recognized in me a genuine desire to understand rather than simply observe. Most people in this fleet never expected to serve in something like this, she told me, as we walked past rows of supply crates being loaded onto waiting vessels. Farmers, teachers, engineers who spent their whole careers building bridges and irrigation systems. We trained for readiness. Yes, every colony does, but training and reality are different animals entirely. She paused, glancing toward a group of young pilots receiving final instructions nearby. None of them wanted this, but every single one of them showed up anyway. I asked her what she believed drove people to volunteer for something so far outside their ordinary lives, especially given how peaceful humanity's recent history had been. She considered the question for a long moment before answering, her eyes distant, as though remembering something from her own past. You ever watch a parent lift something they shouldn't physically be able to lift because their child is trapped underneath it? She asked. That's not about training. That's not about courage in the way people usually mean it. It's something older than that. Something that doesn't ask permission. She looked back at me. Fairhaven was full of families, Kalis. Every single person in this fleet sees their own home in what happened there. Their own children, their own future, taken away in an instant by people who assumed we wouldn't do anything about it. That evening, I finally understood the full weight of what Laura had told me days earlier, when she said that human silence was never peace, but calculation. I stood beside her on the observation deck, watching the assembled fleet prepare for departure. Thousands of ships representing every corner of human civilization, united not by command or coercion, but by something that ran deeper than either. I asked her one final question before the fleet's departure, a question that had been building inside me since the moment I first learned of Fairhaven's fall. "Are you afraid?" I asked her. She was quiet for a long time, watching the ships beyond the viewport shift into formation, their running lights forming patterns against the darkness of space that reminded me, strangely, of constellations. "Yes," she finally said, "but not for the reasons you might think." She turned to look at me, and in her eyes I saw the same warmth I had always known in her, though now paired with something new, something quieter and far more resolute. "I'm not afraid of what happens to them, out there. I'm afraid of what it means that we're capable of this at all. I'm afraid of how easily it came, once we finally let it." I did not have an answer for her. I simply stood beside her in silence, watching the fleet complete its final preparations, feeling the weight of what I was witnessing settle deep into my memory, certain that I would carry this moment with me for the rest of my long life. Before the fleet departed, Nathan found us one last time, his expression softer than it had been throughout the day, carrying a trace of the easygoing man I had known before all of this began. He placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, a human gesture of comfort I had grown familiar with over my years among them. "You asked me once what we were like before we became civilized," he said, referencing a conversation we had shared long ago, back when such questions felt purely academic. "I told you we grew past all that. I think I lied, Kalis, not on purpose. I think I just forgot, because we never needed to remember." He looked out at the fleet, his jaw tightening slightly. "We didn't grow past it. We just chose, every single day, not to let it out. That's different." He left shortly after, called away to his assigned vessel, and I watched him go, with a strange mixture of sorrow and something I could not quite name, some combination of awe and dread that I had never experienced in all my years of studying other species. The fleet departed within the hour, thousands of vessels moving in perfect formation toward coordinates I was not permitted to know, carrying with them engineers, farmers, teachers, and ordinary people who had set aside their peaceful lives to answer a call that came not from a government, but from something far older and far more personal. I stood beside Laura long after the fleet had vanished from sight, both of us silent, watching the empty space where thousands of ships had gathered only hours before. I finally understood what she meant when she said that humanity's peace was never weakness, but a choice, deliberately made and carefully maintained. I understood, too, watching her quiet strength in that moment, that the same gentleness which had made humanity beloved across known space was now the very thing fueling their resolve, transformed by grief and love into something the rest of the galaxy had never truly seen before, and would soon witness in ways none of us could have fully anticipated. The Dravoon Compact believed they had tested a weak and forgiving people, confident that any response would be slow, hesitant, and easily managed through further intimidation. They did not yet understand that they had instead awakened something ancient within a species that had simply chosen, for generations, not to let it show. That choice had just ended. I did not witness the arrival of the human fleet at the Drevin stronghold with my own eyes. Few outside the fleet itself did, but in the days that followed, reports reached the trade station from dozens of independent sources, merchants, monitoring satellites, and neutral observers stationed near the border regions, and together, those reports painted a picture that would be discussed across known space for generations to come. The Dravoon Compact had built its primary military stronghold at a system called Kethrune's Reach, a heavily fortified cluster of shipyards and defense platforms that had allowed them to expand their territory for over a decade without serious challenge. They had grown confident in that stronghold, believing its defenses were more than sufficient to deter any response humanity might muster, particularly given how slowly other species typically organized military action. They had not accounted for a fleet that arrived not weeks or months later, but within days, moving with a coordination and speed that defense analysts across the galaxy would later study for years afterward. I later spoke with a neutral trade captain named Owen Price, who happened to be passing near the border region when the human fleet arrived, and who agreed to share his account with me in exchange for nothing more than my promise to record it honestly. He described watching from a safe distance as the human ships approached Kethrune's Reach, not in a chaotic rush, but in a formation so precise it resembled something closer to a demonstration than an assault. They didn't come in screaming, he told me, his voice still carrying a trace of the unease he must have felt in that moment. They came in silent, every ship exactly where it needed to be. It was almost worse than if they'd been loud about it, like watching someone calmly roll up their sleeves before doing something they'd clearly already decided on. The Drevin Defense Forces, confident in their fortified position, attempted an initial show of strength, launching their own vessels to intercept what they still believed was a smaller, less organized human response than what actually awaited them. Owen described what followed as less of a battle and more of a methodical dismantling, as human ships adapted to Drevin tactics with a speed that left the defenders visibly disoriented. They didn't fight like people looking for glory, Owen said. They fought like people finishing a job. No wasted movement, no unnecessary risk, just steady, relentless pressure until the Dravoon ships had nowhere left to maneuver. I asked him what had surprised him most about what he witnessed, expecting him to mention the scale of the fleet or the speed of their advance. Instead, he described something else entirely, something that stayed with me long after our conversation ended. It was quiet, he said, the whole thing. No triumphant broadcasts, no taunting messages to the enemy fleet, the kind you sometimes hear during conflicts between other species trying to prove a point. The humans didn't seem interested in proving anything to anyone watching. They just did what needed doing and moved on to the next objective. This account matched others I gathered in the days that followed, from traders and independent observers scattered across the border region. A picture emerged of a species that had transformed its legendary emotional depth into something colder and more focused than anyone had anticipated, without losing the humanity that had always defined them. Reports consistently noted that human forces made deliberate efforts to minimize harm to Drevin civilians and support personnel, redirecting engagements away from populated areas even in the middle of active conflict, a detail that struck many observers as unusual given the scale of retaliation being carried out. I later learned, through a conversation with Grace Miller after the fleet's return, that this restraint had been a deliberate strategic priority from the very beginning. We weren't fighting to become what hurt us, she told me, sitting across from me in the same garden dome where Laura had once found me before everything began. Fairhaven happened because someone decided ordinary people didn't matter as much as making a point. We refused to make that same mistake, even while we were making our own point in return. The confrontation at Kethrune's Reach lasted less than 2 days, a time frame that shocked military analysts across dozens of species who had expected a prolonged and costly engagement given the scale of the Dreven stronghold. Instead, human forces systematically dismantled the compact's primary military capability with a precision that left Draven Command unable to organize any meaningful counteroffensive. What followed surprised the galaxy even more than the speed of the initial engagement. Rather than continuing an unrestrained advance into Draven territory, human forces halted at the border of Kethrune's Reach and issued a single formal communication to the remaining Draven leadership, broadcast openly across public channels for the entire galaxy to witness. I watched this broadcast myself from the trade station, alongside representatives from dozens of other species who had gathered to see how this unprecedented conflict would conclude. Claire Wood appeared once again on the screen, her expression calm but carrying an unmistakable weight that had not been present during her earlier address. She spoke directly to the Dreven leadership, her words measured and deliberate. "You attacked people who never threatened you, believing our patience meant we would never respond," she said. "You were wrong. But we did not come here to become what took Fairhaven from us. We came to ensure it never happens again, to us or to anyone else who trusted that peace would be respected." She paused, and something in her expression softened slightly, though her resolve remained clear. "We offer you the chance to withdraw from contested territories and submit to oversight by the Regional Council. This is not mercy born of weakness. It is restraint chosen deliberately, the same restraint we have always practiced, now clearly understood by everyone watching exactly what it costs us to set aside." The Dreven Compact's leadership, faced with the total collapse of their primary military stronghold and the sobering realization of what they had provoked, accepted the terms within hours, a surrender that stunned observers who had expected either total human retaliation or a prolonged and bloody conflict stretching across multiple systems. I spoke with Nathan Cole shortly after the fleet's return to human space, finding him changed once again, though this time in a way that felt like relief, rather than the hardened focus I had witnessed before the confrontation. He looked tired, deeply so, but something in his posture suggested a burden had finally been set down. "We didn't want this," he told me, as we sat together in the quiet of the docking bay where I had first met him discussing ship modifications weeks earlier. "Nobody wakes up hoping for a day like that, but when it came, we didn't run from it either." He looked at me, his eyes carrying a weariness that spoke of things he likely would never fully describe to me. I think that's the part people outside our species never understood. We're not gentle because we're weak. We're gentle because we choose to be, every single day, even though we know exactly what the alternative looks like. I asked him about the restraint humanity had shown throughout the conflict, the deliberate effort to protect Dreven civilians even during active engagement, a detail that continued to puzzle military analysts across known space in the days following the ceasefire. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "If we stopped caring about that, even for a moment, even against people who hurt us first, then we'd become exactly what we were fighting against," he said. "Fairhaven happened because someone decided innocent lives didn't matter as much as their ambition. We weren't about to make that same choice, no matter how much anger we were carrying." I thought of Peter Grant then, of his words during that interview days after Fairhaven's fall, when he spoke of forgiveness and the difference between forgiveness and doing nothing. I understood now what he meant, having witnessed the full scope of what humanity had chosen to do, and equally significant, what they had chosen not to do, even in the depths of their grief and fury. The regional council convened within days of the Dreven surrender, and I attended as an observer alongside representatives from dozens of species who had witnessed the conflict unfold from the safety of neutral territory. The mood in that chamber was unlike anything I had experienced in my many years attending council sessions. Species who had previously viewed humanity with a mixture of affection and mild condescension now regarded them with something closer to careful respect, tinged with an unease that several delegates made little effort to hide. A delegate from a powerful trading consortium, one who had long maintained cordial but distant relations with human representatives, approached me privately during a recess in the proceedings. He asked me, given my long history among humans, whether I believed this conflict represented a permanent change in their nature or simply a temporary departure from their usual character. I considered his question carefully before answering, drawing on everything I had witnessed over the preceding weeks. "I do not believe they changed," I told him. "I believe we simply never saw the whole of what they always were. Their gentleness was real, their patience was real, but so was this, hidden beneath it, the entire time, waiting for a moment, none of them ever wanted to arrive." He seemed unsatisfied with this answer, pressing further about whether other species should now reconsider their approach to humanity going forward, particularly regarding smaller conflicts and territorial disputes that had previously seemed inconsequential given humanity's reputation for patience. I told him honestly that I believed every species across known space would be reconsidering exactly that question for a very long time to come, and that the answer they reached would likely shape the balance of power across the galaxy for generations. He did not respond, though the look on his face told me he already understood the implications of what had just occurred, implications that would ripple outward across every system, every trade route, every diplomatic relationship humanity maintained with the rest of known space. The Dreven Compact, once a rising power feared for its aggressive expansion, now found itself diminished, its military capability shattered, its territorial ambitions curtailed under strict oversight from the regional council. But the true consequence of what had happened at Kethrun's Reach extended far beyond the fate of a single rival power. Every species watching had learned something that would never be forgotten, a lesson written not in threats or propaganda, but in the quiet, devastating clarity of a species that had finally shown the galaxy exactly what its legendary kindness had always been protecting everyone from. A year passed before I returned to Fairhaven, and I did not go alone. Laura invited me herself, arriving at the trade station in person rather than sending a message, something she had not done since before the fall of Fairhaven changed the course of both our lives. She looked well, healthier than I had seen her in the months following the conflict, though something in her carried a permanent weight now, a quiet awareness that had not existed in her before, the kind that comes only from witnessing what a peaceful people are capable of when peace is taken from them by force. We traveled together aboard a small transport, joined partway through the journey by Nathan Cole and Sophie Marsh, both of whom had remained close friends since the events at Kethrun's Reach. The four of us spoke little during the trip, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we would find upon arrival, though I sensed an unspoken agreement among us that this visit mattered in ways none of us fully articulated aloud. Fairhaven had changed since I last saw it in memory, though the reconstruction efforts had already accomplished more than I expected. New homes stood where the old ones had been destroyed, built with careful attention to the original designs, honoring what had been lost rather than simply replacing it. Fields of golden grain, similar to the ones I remembered from my first visit years earlier, stretched across the restored landscape, tended by colonists who had returned to rebuild what had been taken from them. I found Peter Grant working in one such field, older now in ways that went beyond simple passage of time, though his warmth remained largely intact, softened but not extinguished by everything he had endured. He greeted me with the same genuine kindness I remembered from our first meeting, embracing me in the human custom I had grown accustomed to over my years among them. We spoke for a long while that afternoon, sitting together at the edge of his restored field, watching his children, older now, playing a modified version of cricket nearby, their laughter carrying across the open air in a way that felt like a quiet victory against everything that had tried to silence it. I asked him how he felt about everything that had happened since Fairhaven's fall, about the fleet that had answered on his colony's behalf, about the conflict that had reshaped the galaxy's understanding of his entire species. He considered the question for a long time before answering, watching his children play with an expression that held both sorrow and profound gratitude in equal measure. "I don't celebrate what happened out there," he said finally. "I don't think anyone who understands what actually occurred celebrates it. But I understand why it happened, and I'm grateful my children get to grow up in a galaxy that knows exactly what it would cost to try something like this again." He paused, looking toward the horizon where new construction continued steadily. "We didn't become monsters to protect what we love. We just stopped pretending we couldn't when the moment finally demanded it." I thought about his words for a long time after our conversation ended, turning them over in my mind as I walked with Laura through the rebuilt colony later that evening, watching the sun set over fields that had once been reduced to ruin. The Regional Council, in the months following the Dreven surrender, had convened extensively to reconsider the galaxy's broader understanding of humanity's role among the greater community of known species. I attended several of these sessions as an observer, watching delegates from dozens of civilizations grapple with implications that extended far beyond the fate of a single conflict. A new understanding had settled across known space, unspoken but universally acknowledged among every species that maintained contact with human territory. Humanity's patience, once dismissed by some as a curious weakness to be exploited, was now recognized for what it had always truly been: a deliberate and costly restraint maintained through discipline rather than incapacity. And beneath that restraint, every species now understood, existed a resolve capable of reshaping the balance of an entire region within a matter of days, should that restraint ever be tested again. I recall a conversation with Grace Miller, held sometime after our return from Fairhaven, in which she reflected on the broader consequences of everything that had unfolded since the attack that started it all. "People think strength and gentleness are opposites," she told me, as we sat together watching ships depart from the trade station on ordinary business, commerce continuing as it always had, despite everything the galaxy had witnessed. "They're not opposites, Kalis. They're the same thing, wearing different faces depending on what the moment requires. We were gentle because we chose to be, every single day, for generations, and we were exactly as capable of the opposite, because that choice was always ours to make." I found myself reflecting deeply on this idea throughout the months that followed, drawing on everything I had witnessed since that first alarm sounded aboard the trade station, so long ago now that it felt like a different lifetime entirely. I had spent over 2 centuries studying various species across known space, cataloging their strengths and weaknesses, their customs and contradictions, believing I understood the fundamental nature of every civilization I encountered. Humanity had taught me something I had never fully grasped in all those centuries of study. Compassion, I came to understand, was not the absence of fierce and terrible capability. It was the deliberate choice to set that capability aside, day after day, in favor of kindness, forgiveness, and patience, precisely because the alternative was always present, always possible, always waiting quietly beneath the surface for a moment that demanded its return. The Dreven Compact, diminished but not destroyed, remained under strict oversight from the Regional Council in the years that followed, their ambitions curtailed by an agreement they had little choice but to accept, given the alternative they had already witnessed firsthand. Other species across known space, some who had previously tested boundaries with smaller, weaker colonies without serious consequence, grew notably more cautious in their dealings with any territory bearing even distant connection to human protection or alliance. A new phrase began circulating quietly through diplomatic circles across known space in the months following the conflict, spoken carefully among delegates who understood its full weight: "Never harm what humans love." It was not a formal law, not an official decree issued by any council or government, but an understanding that settled into the collective awareness of every civilization that had witnessed what happened when that unspoken boundary was crossed. I remained close with Laura, Nathan, and Sophie throughout the following years, watching each of them return, gradually, to the warmth and openness that had defined them before Fairhaven's fall, though something in each of them remained permanently changed, a quiet awareness of their own capability that none of them had fully possessed before. Laura once asked me, during a quiet evening we shared together long after the conflict had ended, whether I still viewed humanity the way I had before everything happened, whether the fear I must have felt during those terrible days had permanently altered how I understood her people. I considered her question carefully, wanting to give her an honest answer rather than a comfortable one, in the same manner she had always shown me throughout our long friendship. "I do not fear you," I told her. "I fear what would happen to anyone foolish enough to threaten what you love, but I have never once feared you, Laura, not through any of this." I paused, searching for the right words to express something I had been contemplating for months. "I think I understand you more completely now than I ever did before. Your kindness was never separate from your strength. It was always the same thing, expressed through restraint, through choice, through a discipline that most species could never hope to match." She smiled at this, though something in her eyes carried the weight of everything we had witnessed together, a shared understanding that would remain between us for the rest of our lives. "That's why it mattered so much to hold on to the kindness afterward," she said. "Anyone can be gentle when nothing threatens them. The real test is choosing gentleness again, even after you've proven to yourself and everyone else exactly what the alternative looks like." I have thought about her words many times since that evening, turning them over in my mind whenever I encounter new delegates from distant species who ask me, given my long history among humans, what truly happened during those terrible weeks that reshaped the galaxy's understanding of an entire civilization. I tell them the same thing every time, the closest truth I have found after decades of reflection on everything I witnessed. Humanity's rage did not shake the universe because it was the loudest, or the most destructive, or the most overwhelming display of force known space had ever witnessed. Other conflicts throughout galactic history had certainly claimed greater scales of destruction, greater losses, greater displays of raw military power. What made humanity's response different, what made it echo across every system and every species that heard of it, was the revelation it carried within it. For generations, humanity had shown the galaxy only their capacity for love, patience, and forgiveness, and many species, myself included, had mistaken that capacity for the entirety of who they were. What shook the universe was not the discovery that humans could fight. Every species can fight, given sufficient provocation. What shook the universe was the realization that the very same hearts capable of humanity's extraordinary compassion were equally capable of an equally extraordinary and terrible resolve, and that the only reason the galaxy had never witnessed it before was because humanity, every single day, for generations, had simply chosen not to let it out. That choice, once broken by an act of senseless destruction against people who had only ever wanted peace, revealed something the rest of known space would never forget. Compassion and resolve were never opposites among this remarkable species. They were always two expressions of the very same heart, and the galaxy would spend generations remembering exactly what that heart was capable of, when finally given no other choice but to answer in kind. I remain, even now, deeply grateful that humanity chose, in the end, to return to the gentleness that had always defined them, having proven beyond any doubt across every corner of known space exactly what that gentleness had always been protecting the galaxy from witnessing. And I remain equally certain that no species across the stars will ever again make the mistake of believing that kindness, freely given, is the same as weakness, freely offered. Humanity taught the universe otherwise, in the span of a single, unforgettable season, and the universe has never forgotten the lesson since.